So,
wilde een presentatie wisselen.
Yes, if you. Yes, this is here.
So good morning. I come from the University of Aveiro, Department of Social, Political and Territorial Sciences, where we've been discussing, and dealing with these issues for some time. This is a work, a joint research from me and Elena. She has been also an active member of this group. And this is like a sequence from a previous work that we did on self-organization, a paper that we submitted to Town Planning Review, and then we got the first feedback from the reviewers. We realized that we didn't have material for one, but for two papers. So the first one is published on Town Planning Review on self-organization, and this one now is under revision in another journal on co-evolution. Our topic, and our main topic was this one, was to think back on what was the process of formalizing informal settlements in Portugal, and how could we see on that co-evolutionary signs, and that for what? If we realize that, okay, it's fine, but what's the usefulness of that? Maybe to learn how to make new approaches in other contexts. And in this presentation, we mainly focus on the role that planners, and how can we revisit the role of planners in planning process, having in mind the complexity perspective and learning from co-evolutionary processes. So in this case, we are dealing, in the Portuguese case, we are dealing specifically with informal settlements that are related with the non-approved constructions in non-approved non-urbanized soil, in which people bought the land, but in fact they just did that. There's no other legal process associated with the occupation of the land. And this moved from being a very important feature in the urban fabric of metropolitan Lisbon area in the 1980s, where 10% of the population would live in places like that, in the metropolitan area, and moved to some kind of non-existent problem these days. So it was reduced almost to zero. This is referred by the United Nations as one of the experiments and one of the cases that could be used to inspire interventions in other contexts, because it has been seen as a success. And also in Europe, the United Nations refers there's still 50 million people living in informal settlements, and mainly in Eastern Europe these days. So the context, which is important here to understand the process, is that this is the Portuguese context of informalization, had to do with very strong migratory movements from the countryside to the cities. It had to do, this brought together a certain amount of aims, of people, of having their own ground, of having a multiplicity of aims and expectations about the spaces they occupied. Also, this provoked different spatial patterns. We don't have like a typology of informal settlements, we have a variety of it. And also this carried with it a certain critical aspects and insecurity, for instance, in terms of the occupation of the place, etc. Planning institutions' reaction by nature was very based on a routine, and that failed for decades. Then these started to be seen as a new task for the planning institutions. And finally, when we look back to the process, we can identify here three phases. One of clearly non-cooperation that led later on to a cooperation phase, and in between a double behavior, let's say, phase in which there was like, on one hand, support, on the other hand, control. So it's like a mixed phase between these two, of cooperation and non-cooperation. So we look at a context in the long term, 1960s to 2014, because we're looking to legal frameworks, etc. And also, we are looking on the way that planning institutions reacted to informal settlements. So these are our, if we understand these as a system, as the urban system, the planning institutions are here as one of subsystems within the urban system, and informal settlements are another subsystem. By planning institutions, we mean both agencies and organizations, but also norms and rules. They are all considered as planning institutions. So the two questions that we on this paper we are trying to answer is, on one hand, how can these behavior affected each other's subsystems, one interacting with the other, and on the other hand, what is specifically the planner's role in the process. Regarding informal settlements evolution, because we are talking about parallel evolutions between the two subsystems, we had a peripheral, this started by being a peripheral process within the urban fabric of the main cities, but mainly from the capital, from metropolitan area of Lisbon. It had a tipping point that had to do, and this has some connection with the previous presentation. It was the change, the revolution that led from dictatorship to democracy, because that recognized housing rights, association rights, meeting rights, freedom of speech, etc. So that was a clear tipping point that we identified in this process. We have a learning process identified on this period between the revolution and 1995, which is when the Informal Settlements Act is launched, is published, and it starts to be applied. And in the paper that I just referred, that was published last year, we identified here, associated with this co-evolutionary process, two levels of self-organization. The first one among or within the informal settlements, in which they start to organize and start to create associations and start to discuss what was going to be their future. But there was an interesting experimental moment in which also informal settlements self-organized with municipalities, and we had for a brief period of 2-3 years technical support offices combining in a public institution members from the informal settlements and also architects and people from the public administration. So this was a very interesting and short period that is almost forgotten by now, but looking at it from the complexity perspective, it becomes very interesting and relevant to understand the process. Well, we try to identify what is usually related with evolution and co-evolutionary processes, and we have like three main conditions for this to happen. One of them is continuity on time, long-term relations on one hand, and from non-cooperating to cooperating, there's 40 years of relations between planning institutions and informal settlements. Also, the diversity of planning institutions on one hand, from the parliament that approved the Informal Settlements Act until the local government, local authorities that were dealing directly with the informal settlements. On one hand, diversity there, but also diversity of the informal settlements. High density, low density, seasonal occupation, permanent occupation. There was a huge diversity of informality. And finally, stress. Stress as something that provokes the moving on and to look for solutions together. So stress for informal settlements, or either they formalized or they were tending to disappear. On one hand, stress from the planning institutions' side also, because the pressure to solve this problem was huge in the society. And after the entrance of Portugal to the European Union in 1986, it started also to be a top-down pressure to solve. We analyzed the governmental programs from the democratic period, and from 1976 until 1986, informal settlements are always addressed as a housing scarcity problem. From 1986, the year that we entered the European Union, on until 1995, it's always addressed as a planning problem and an environmental problem. And in 1995 on, when the law is launched, it disappeared from the government programs, which is also interesting. It shows like the moment you have a law, you have a tool, the problem is not important anymore, or it's gone. It's solved. Problem solved. So we identified on this co-evolutionary process several qualities, from continuity on the process. There's not like breaking the structures, there's continuity on the structures that are involved in the process from the early days until today. The associations of neighbors became management commissions, for instance. So there's like a continuity on the process. There's also a selection. Not all the informal settlements were addressed. For instance, the ones that were in sensitive ecological areas were left apart. But then the other ones were very important to solve the problem. This image is from the largest one in Portugal. It has 450 hectares and the capacity for 50,000 inhabitants, so it's just one single operation. And it was crucial because our law, general law said, well, in order to register a piece of land, you have to have all the co-owners together in the notary. I mean, this became impossible when you have this size of co-owners, and this created for the first time an exception on the law, saying, okay, there's an exceptional case in which we can apply an exceptional rule. And that the learning process from that rule made it be applied for the general law. And today, even if you have a small allotment or a parceling out or a small detailed plan, you don't have to bring all the owners together. You just go with a plan that was approved to the notary one by one, and you register your piece of land. And this was a learning process that moved from the informal sphere to the formal sphere. Experimentation, information change, and contamination processes were very important. I'm going to skip this a little bit because I would like to focus a little bit on the planner's role. These are some signs of formality from the management and from the residents, the landowners. Status. They were just these poor people coming from the countryside. In 20 years they were paying offices to make urban plans for their pieces of land, and they were gaining some official entity, fiscal entity, and also a sort of responsibilities. Well, from both sides they had to give up on something. Planning institutions had to give up on rigidity on some aspects of the planning, the spatial planning laws that we had, but on the other hand, the informal settlements also were forced to acquire some formality in the way they behaved. So this was a very tailor-made law that allowed to include a huge diversity of situations in this process. And this is the diversity. On the top left side, you have in yellow all the areas affected by informal settlements in the metropolitan area, but they ranged from high density to low density, from privileged situations like this one, where mainly you have secondary houses. It's a seasonal area. So this diversity fed the process, and this diversity was double. On one hand, in terms of actors, we identified 3 brokers. One of them is now our actual prime minister. At the time, he was a town councillor from the Socialist Party in one of the municipalities that was most affected by informality, by informal settlements. A lawyer, a landowner, they have specific roles played. They are clearly identified in the paper, and they represent also different kinds. They brought their diversity also to the process by representing different kinds of informal settlements, from more intensive use ones to more extensive and secondary housing occupations. So, looking at these 3 phases that I was describing and looking for the planners' roles in terms of outputs and outcomes, you can see here a big diversity in terms of intervention that starts by a very reduced one in the early ages, until one in which they had a strong intervention in this one, in the intermediate phase. When you look strangely enough, when the law was launched, they were like very discreet. They disappeared from the map. So, final ideas on co-evolution and also on the role of the planners. First of all, the fact that the planning institutions were open to change and to be flexible. That was very important, and that happened in a very specific historical context. Well, that plasticity, let's say that there was shown by both subsystems, had to do with pressure, had to do also with the ability to experiment and to try different situations, but also created a contamination effect on other planning acts by the end. So, this is my final slide. What is the role of the planners here? Apparently it's a very discrete one, but if we see these like in a simple way, but if we see it on a complex way, they are feeding the process in a moment that they are very important to gather information, to test, and to prove that the current solutions are not valid anymore. We have to look for new ones to validate that. But then when it comes to formalize and to publish this Informal Settlements Law Act, they were almost absent. And, well, that doesn't show that they are less important or more important. They show that they had an important role in a very early stage of the process. Thank you.
Okay. Well, respond.
Thank you for your interesting presentation and also. So I was wondering, in the paper, you mentioned the period that it became a planning problem from the 1976, I think. And you mentioned the first attempts were being made to plan informal settlements. And maybe that refers to the self-organization within the institutional part, but I was wondering, it seems quite contradictory. So how did it start, and the role of the land associations in it, and don't you risk to only have the most prominent land associations and not everyone? So I was wondering kind of about the roles and the interests they had and the importance they had in the process, and also on the side of the institutions.
So in that first, in that early phase from 1976 to 1995, the focus of these processes was really to solve what was considered the ones. It was a period, first of all, in everything was very ideological. So ideology was also part of it. So housing was seen finally, with the democratic period, was seen as a constitutional right. So although people were occupying illegally the land, the legitimacy of having the right to a home started to be recognized by institutions. And that means that these kind of permanent houses were even supported by municipalities, as opposed to temporary houses, in which at the same time demolitions were occurring. So we had this control and support phase happening at the same time. There's an extreme moment, for instance, on the role of planning institutions. Really, there was almost a breakdown within the cohesion of the planning administration, in which the central government would say, well, in order to put pressure on informal settlements to come up with solutions to formalize the areas. So there was here an acceptation from the central government. One had to the infrastructures could not be provided to them until they would come up with a solution. It was like a way of putting pressure on them. And there was a case in which one municipality decides against what the central government was said and decided no, although the central government has these instructions, send these instructions, we are going to provide electricity to these neighborhoods. And there's a threat, I have the document within our research, there's a threat from the government, the central government, threatening to put the municipality in court for not respecting the law. So there's really a breakdown here in the cohesion of the public administration at a certain point, and this is very relevant to understand how critical was that period. So that was and the formalization of these areas. When we say planning informal settlements means not just to legalize what started to be illegal, but is to do it within a planning framework, which means to provide proper infrastructure, to have proper public spaces for these areas, to make sure that public spaces for collective facilities exist, etc. So each one of them has to provide a part of land or have to pay to buy lands elsewhere in the surroundings in order to make sure that these facilities are created. That's what the difference between being informal and being a planned informal settlements. They have to respect what are the planning rules, for instance, also, as any other settlement. And this was very different in Greece. They had, like a few years ago, what was called self-recognition process, in which you would recognize yourself, declare yourself as informal, and that was like a kind of amnesty, and that was accepted. Here the process was more complicated than that, because it implied a commitment from the informal settlements on providing the same conditions that any other urban area should acquire. And in fact, these days, some of these areas have much better conditions in terms of urban areas, because they were so pushy with them than any other regular areas.
That was really interesting. I heard your prior presentation, so I have the context. So this kind of like progressing. It's really interesting. This is a minor detail, but I anyways asking because I think I might be missing something. You have this classification of requirements for pollution. You have the agents, the ontology, and then you have the stress, and the third one was what was it again? Diversity. Thanks. So I was wondering, where are the evolving subsystems from this classification? You mentioned them in the end, but to me, I think to co-evolve, you have to have something evolving already.
Yeah.
So you have agents which form systems which are evolving, and then they're evolving together, kind of like that.
I briefly mentioned it here when I said that, well, associated with these evolutionary processes, you had self-organizing processes as well going on. And self-organization was like the early stages of evolution. In the first very early stage, it was the self-organization of informal settlements, just started by very simple agendas, like the basic one is I want to protect my land, to be taken by the authorities, and I want to protect the few constructions I made in my land. And starts from a very individual behavior to something that then comes to a moment that they say, oh, hey, okay, now we have to commit and have a planning agenda. And that happens when, after they form as neighbors associations or landowners associations, and then they start to realize, well, we have to meet, we have to go to architect's office and talk to them and to discuss technical solutions. It's not just about not plot the plan anymore, but this. And later with the act, with the approval of the act, they can even be responsible by making plans, by making urban plans or detailed plans. And this implies an entire sense from accountability, from all the financial, to all the regulations approved, everything. So they came from this very basic background to a very sophisticated, in fact, organizational. And this was due to this interaction with informal settlements. And that is where we see not just the evolutionary process, but the co-evolutionary process, because it's an intertwined process between the two.
So in a way you have different levels and time.
Yeah.
So you have the system self-organizing, then you have evolution, then you have co-evolution
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah, we explained that, let's say, in 2 episodes. The first one that was published last year, and this one is about more focus on the evolutionary process.
Well, thank you for this very practical story. It's almost like a documentary in the shape of a paper, and I think it is a documentary. So maybe that's a side note that I'm doing here. One observation, just in your recent response, is that what's very striking in this story and very interesting is that planners or architects weren't put in charge. They were almost placed in the field as a sort of infrastructure. And then this context was created where there was pressure, and when at a certain point these landowners or these homeowners, because they weren't landowners yet, actually turned to them and had a question for them, said, we need you. Whereas it's usually the other way around. It's the governmental agencies that said, well, you know, we have a planner, we need a planner, we need a plan. Let's give your information, but they only come, the inhabitants only come to give information and so on and so on. Here, it seems like they actually went to the planners, asked them a question, helping them to solve a problem, and not the other way around, like planners going to the inhabitants, asking them to solve their problems. Am I right in this observation, or is that?
Yeah, they were asked to be part of the process, because we are also talking in a moment in which the social role of architects was very, very strong. So they were like, they felt almost by nature engaged into the process of solving housing problems first, and then later environmental problems. But they were invited from both sides, because on one hand, you had municipalities producing plans and having an urge of new planning tools in order to deal with informality. But on the other hand, informal settlements were asked to provide, to have new tools, to present new technical documents in order to make their settlements being formalized and being approved.
And how has this case now informed your thinking or your view on your field? I mean, if you go through such a research project and you follow this up, how has it changed the way you...
It changes my scale of values. We tend to see always architects and planners, etc., in the center of the planning process, and this is one case that maybe shows that from this simple perspective, they are not in the center anymore. because when the center, if you consider the center, the planning law, the lawmaking process, they were really out of it. But when you look at it from the complexity perspective, they were very important in a moment of feeding the process with information, with proving technically that it was impossible with the traditional tools to solve a new problem. And I think this was this changed my perception. Maybe it's one of the lessons that I also take from reflecting on these once again here with you, is that thing, that this scale of values really changes. And also the fact that the planners disappear, or also the field that, the context that allowed this co-evolution had to do, in our perspective, with the fact that informal settlements were very much in the periphery of the planning institution's agenda. So this creates a certain freedom to experiment. The core, I mean, and this has some parallel with the Jerusalem case, the core remains stable while the periphery goes bubbling and exchanging information and trying and experimenting. And this is probably only, well, maybe informality or these informal settlements were useful to create a space for experimentation.
We've got time for one quick question. One more.
Thank you very much, Bob. It was very insightful. I'm interested in this question of illegality because it somehow short-circuits or goes outside code, which is law.
Yeah.
And I was hoping there's a question of scale because this informal illegal situation can exist, but actually passes under the radar until it reaches a certain scale. So I think these are the weak signals of the stress that makes the beginning of the manifestation of informal settlement. And to go to the most minimum detail, I suppose that before these individuals decide to go outside the city because it becomes too expensive, I suppose these are suppositions, they then seek an opportunity where they can buy into a lesser cost for their housing subject. So they are probably buying land outside the city. Do they buy it or do they occupy it illegally?
No, they bought.
So there's a transaction which passes through a notary that passes without being seen because it's just a flick on the screen.
Yeah,
then it becomes a lot of flicks on the screen and it becomes
the transaction was legal.
Yeah.
Because the acquisition or the business was made in a context in which you are co-owner of the piece of land. So officially you are co-owner, and co-ownership means nobody is owner of any part in particular. Everybody is owner of everything. The illegal part.
Group acquisition.
Yeah.
The group organizes itself in.
We would go to a notary in 7 moments, even in the time of period, and we would buy each one a share of something. And that was still according to the law. What was not according to the law was the division of the land. Because this was rural land, and rural land cannot be divided.
So not illegal, just informal.
The process of dividing the land was illegal, in fact, because the law forbade that division.
Yes. Yeah. But the building.
And the buildings were also illegal, since you cannot build in land that is not legal, according to the law.
Thank you so much.
Right.
It was wonderful. Do you want to introduce yourself and come over?
Sure. I can slip the